Let me start off by sort of talking about what doesn't change. What you probably can't tell about this particular thing is that this is actually a white gold ring. And the reason why that's important is because white gold is not a naturally occurring mineral. White gold is an alloy. White gold is actually a bunch of different things that are blended together in interesting sort of hybrid ways. You can't go mine white gold in a mine someplace. And the reason why this is important is because your typical models of general education that you find at most institutions are either core or cafeteria kinds of models. The core model is everybody takes exactly the same courses all the time. They walk through them in lockstep. The extreme of this is probably St. John's, right? Everybody takes exactly the same thing for all 4 years. You get to a place like Columbia or Chicago where you've got core sequences that everybody takes at different times during their undergraduate program. So that's kind of one model of what it means to be generally educated. And then there's the other model, which is much more popular among large state universities, the cafeteria or smorgasbord model, in which you just choose a bunch of different stuff and it doesn't really have much coherence to it because it's just a bunch of different stuff. So the cafeteria model. AU's never done either one of those. So the basic core design principle of general education is that it's always been a blend of different elements, not a synthesis of a core, but a blend of different things that kind of come together. So what we've always offered to students is a set of choices within limits. The idea that we think students should be broadly educated across these different areas of human knowledge and learning and experience, that stays, right? So we think that that's important. But we think that the fact that we've always offered a set of diverse courses, not a set of specialized core classes that every AU student has to take, because trying to achieve consensus on that would be really difficult. What would actually be in the core class that all AU students would take? We got a really diverse student body, so it's really hard to figure out what that would be. The task force decided this was a design principle we wanted to keep, that there would still be courses not taught by a centralized GenEd department, but that they would continue to be regular courses taught by people who are in departments and located within regular majors and regular disciplines, right? Taught throughout the entire university. So we decided that. And we decided that the real strength of general education, as it is here, is the fact that because it's this choice within limits, it's not just take 2 courses from any courses in sociology or whatever. Instead, there are a set of program-wide values. So Lynn referenced learning objectives earlier. One of the things that we basically decided in the course of thinking about this is that we are shifting the way we understand general education as a management philosophy. Rather than trying to figure out what should go on everybody's general education syllabus, we are going to confine ourselves to thinking about the outcomes for being generally educated at the level of the program and let you, the departments and faculty, figure out what the actual means are to get to those things, because you know how to do that and we don't. So what we have instead, we took a set of general education learning outcomes. This is a list that is derived from the classic list that we had previously. We updated the language a little bit because when we discovered and went back and looked at some of the documents, some of the original language for the GenEd learning outcomes and learning goals was actually written by Anne Farron herself, right? The one after whom the teaching conference is named, right? So this is 20-some-year-old language. The language has been around for a long time. So we went back and looked at it and said, actually, we got to update this just a little bit. And this is our distillation of the basic outcomes for being a generally educated person. This is what the committee decided, this is what the task force decided after looking at the existing kinds of things. That somebody who is generally educated would have the ability, while they are in college, to develop themselves in all of these basic areas. Now, I want to right away point something out that's really important here. These are program outcomes. These are not outcomes for every individual class in the program. So if you're teaching an art history class and going, how am I going to put quantitative literacy into my course? Don't worry. That's not your job. This is for the program as a whole, not for each individual class. In fact, one of the things the task force recommended and one of the things that was accepted is that in the future, a general education course will designate which of these things it is specifically trying to address. This will help a great deal when it comes to assessment of the course, because instead of doing something silly like taking a second-level science class and looking to see how it enriches communication skills, we will say, what exactly is this class trying to do? And let's see whether it's doing it. there you go. Much easier to figure these kinds of things out if we actually give the course the ability, or the instructors and the departments the ability to figure out exactly what their courses are going to be addressing. We think progressing through the entire program, all 10 courses that they have to take, they will have opportunities to develop these kinds of literacies or competencies. But they're not going to do it in one massive super course, which is somehow going to hit all of these areas at the same time. So don't worry about that, right? Think about your courses and what they will most effectively speak to and what opportunities they will most effectively provide to students. That is what the GenEd program would like people to consider. Now, what does this mean in practice? Well, what this means is a somewhat interesting change of management philosophy, where we're not interested at the level of general education in the exact mechanics of everybody's class. We are instead interested in the outcomes that are achieved. Departments know a heck of a lot better than they do. I mean, as GenEd, I've been GenEd director for, 4 or 5 years now, and the number of conversations that I've had where a faculty member will come in with a really neat idea, and they'll say, okay, good, and it's like, tell me about it. And then they'll start talking about it. It's like, okay, great. And as an educated layperson, I think that sounds like a really good idea, but I don't have the slightest idea whether that's going to fly as a chemistry course because, you know, I'm not a chemist. And do you have a really great idea that you think is going to fly as an advanced literature class? You know what? I'm not a lit specialist. I don't know. If your department's fine with it, cool, that's great. It's not my job as general education director, or our job as the general education bureaucracy, to figure out what counts in terms of individual departments. It's our job to figure out how these courses contribute to the program outcomes that we're interested in. And so if a faculty member and a department are able to articulate how they think this course speaks to these general education goals, that's really what we want to know. That's what we're interested in here, not about... I remember when I first started being the GenEd director, we would have these strange meetings sometimes where the GenEd committee would start looking at people's syllabi in extreme detail and say things like, I think the reading level's a little too high in week 4. And I would kind of scratch my head and I was like, well, you're not in that discipline. How would you know if that's an appropriate level of reading for that particular thing? I mean, it didn't really strike me as the best way to do it. So what we tried to do is shift it over toward, and we're interested in the big picture here. And there'll be assessment to make sure these courses and these programs are actually hitting these kinds of goals. That will come about later on. But the idea here is that we're not interested in telling departments how to teach. We're interested in unleashing the creativity of departments and individual faculty members for hitting the kinds of goals that we as a university community have decided are the important goals of being a generally educated person, right? So our role, our main admin role, honestly, is to figure out whether there are enough seats across an area. So we will run these reports to see how many actual GenEd seats there are in particular areas 1 through 5 in the course of a semester, though that will become a much more interesting calculation for reasons we'll talk about in just a second, because we relaxed something that was a big bottleneck before. So our job is to make sure there are enough seats for all the students who want to be able to take them. Our job is to be a data warehouse. We have a whole lot of information about comparative enrollment, so we know what's going to fill and what's not going to fill based on sort of our experience of this. So if you've got an idea for a neat new course, we can talk about things like who might be interested in taking it across the university and what would it be competing with, and maybe you only want to pilot one section of it rather than launching 3 right away. So we can sort of talk about that because we have that kind of big data-driven picture that we can use to be able to talk about how it all fits together. And in the event, unlikely, of conflicting goals, then we're very happy to mediate and get people talking to one another about what kinds of sections should actually be offered and what kinds of classes are complementary and so on and so forth. Because we don't want too much needless duplication, though if they're all filling, then the duplication must not be needless. If you've got a whole bunch of sections of things that look to be relatively similar, but students seem to be taking all of them, okay, well, I don't think that's a problem. As long as they're filling up, as long as we don't have a lot of wasted resources and a lot of people trying to offer classes that nobody's interested in taking. You know, as long as the class meets the kind of general education standards that we're interested in, you know, we kind of let the students figure out what they want to take, and then we go from there. We're not going to tell the students, you have to take this class. We're going to say you've got 5 areas, and you've got to take 2 classes within each area. You'll notice something I'm not talking about. And then we're going to talk about this a little later, but I'm sort of leading up to it already. You notice I'm not talking about levels and clusters. I'm not talking about that, and the reason I'm not talking about that is because they don't exist anymore. There are no levels, there are no clusters. And all the students, if there were any students in the room, would be cheering wildly at the moment, because the biggest student complaint over the years has been these levels and clusters. This idea that somehow if I've taken one 100-level class in an area, I have to go and take something from this restricted list rather than this list on the other side. And this has been endlessly frustrating, I know, for advisors who will look at the general education offerings and say, you know what, given your interest, the class you really want to take is this one over here, but you can't, because there's a gen ed rule that says you can't do it. In a lot of cases, those rules didn't make an awful lot of sense, so those are gone. Students choose 2 classes from each of the 5 areas. That's that.